Molt bona tarda a tothom. Moltíssimes gràcies per acompanyar-nos en aquesta conversa entre els escriptors Salman Rushdie i Lisa Appignanesi, que inaugura avui el Festival de Literatura Kosmopolis després del magnífic diàleg que hem presenciat entre Tsitsi Dangaremba i David Guzmán, amb una tarda dedicada a la defensa de la llibertat d'expressió. Thanks so much, Salman and Lisa, for accepting our invitation. It is a great honor and a pleasure to host you. We also welcome those who are following us from London, thanks to our collaboration with the Royal Society of Literature. In a world that tends to close its borders, we are committed to promote international cultural exchange. Salman Rushdie és un dels autors més destacats de la literatura contemporània. Al CCCB vam tenir el privilegi de rebre'l en persona l'any 2015 i és un honor que avui ens hagi volgut acompanyar coincidint amb la traducció al català i al castellà de la col·lecció dels seus assajos Els llenguatges de la veritat i de la publicació en castellà de la seva fantàstica novel·la Victory City. Li agraeixo molt profundament que hagi acceptat de ser amb nosaltres aquí després d'aquest any tan difícil. Quan va recollir el prestigiós Premi de la Pau a Frankfurt aquest cap de setmana, Salman Rushdie ens va recordar que la llibertat, i sobretot la llibertat d'expressió, està en risc arreu del món. L'única manera de contrarrestar aquesta ofensiva és, i el cito, respondre als mals discursos amb bons discursos, replicar els relats falsos amb millors històries, respondre a l'odi amb amor i creure que la veritat encara pot prevaldre en l'era de la mentida. Va continuar dient que hem de defensar la llibertat d'expressió amb força i definir-la el més àmpliament possible. I, per tant, hem de defensar també aquells discursos que ens ofenen, perquè, si no, en realitat no estem defensant la llibertat d'expressió. Salman Rushdie i Lisa Appignanesi comparteixen una llarga amistat, una mateixa passió per la imaginació i un fort compromís a favor de la llibertat d'expressió, especialment a través del pen, però també dels seus llibres i de la seva vida pública. La Lisa és una fantàstica i reconeguda escriptora britànica, experta en Freud, psicoanàlisi i gènere. És l'autora d'obres de ficció i no ficció que inclouen llibres tan importants com Mad, Bad and Sad, A History of Women and the Mind Doctors since the 1800s to the Present, i més recentment Everyday Madness, On Grief, Anger and Loss, malauradament encara no traduïts a casa nostra. La Lisa és una figura clau en l'escena cultural britànica i europea. És una fellow a Oxford i al King's College. Va ser la presidenta del Museu de Freud de Londres durant molts anys i del jurat del Booker International que va premiar Olga Tokarczuk abans de rebre el Nobel. La Lisa és una autèntica intel·lectual pública, igual de compromesa amb la seva literatura que amb la qualitat del debat públic i la vida cultural, un compromís que avui pren més sentit que mai. Thanks so much, dear Lisa, for the care and generosity with which you have curated this evening and helped us with the festival, and for your work and friendship over the years. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Judy. I have to confess that I rather like being called La Lisa. It's never happened to me before, I don't think. And it's great, much better than my other name. Salman, it's so wonderful to have you here with us, even if virtually, but you're a huge presence on all sides of us here.
Hello, everybody. Hello, nice to be with you.
And we're quadruply pleased because we know that you've been through a lot of shit. Excuse my language. And I think the first thing I really want to hear from you is, how are you? Tell us how you've been faring.
I'm all right, thank you. I mean, it's been a while now, so I'm very largely recovered. I mean, the human body is an amazing thing.
Right, 14 months, is it?
Yeah, something like that.
Right. It is extraordinary, and I'm told that you've also started writing again and have almost got a new book.
Yes, I actually not almost. I've just finished it.
Wonderful.
A book arising out of the attack on me I mean, not just a description, but a kind of essay type book thinking about matters around that.
When you wrote about yourself in the past, during your book about the fat voyeurs, Joseph Anton, you wrote it in the third person, and it was a rather, well, a different kind of spy story, shall we say. Is this book in the first person, third person?
This, I think, somebody sticks a knife in you, that's a first person event.
Can you say any more?
It just seemed right to be writing it in the first person because it just seemed more direct on this occasion. It's not the same kind of book as Joseph Anton. That was spread over a decade, more than a decade. This is about one thing, and the implications of it.
Right, and it's short, long.
It's a couple of 100 pages, not that long.
Okay. Well, can't
I mean,
wait.
60,000 words, roughly speaking, half the length of Victory City, just to give you an idea of it.
So meditations take less pages than fiction.
At least I run out of ideas. That's the other thing.
So tell me about this different process, writing fiction and writing, I guess, memoir, essay. I don't know quite how you've approached it.
Well, the funny thing is, when I started out being a writer, it never occurred to me ever that I would ever write autobiography or memoir. It was something I was not even slightly interested in. My reason for becoming a writer was always to make up stories, to find things that were not me, but that had to do with the world and were hopefully interesting. But somehow I've ended up with not one but two autobiographical texts because of the way my life turned out. But it was never part of my plan. My plan continues to be to make things up. So I hope to return to that.
Well, I hope so too, despite the best laid plans, etc., etc. I'd like to ask you, before we move on to the fiction more closely, a little bit about your life championing free expression, because this has been going on for some time. And during that time of championing free expression, both as president of PEN, but also really helping many other writers who have had kinds of fatwas put on them that are much less well known than yours. You've held on to the importance of this free imaginative expression. It's changed in the time that you and I have been involved in this world. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about that history and what you think about it now.
Well, it just feels bizarre to have to defend it at all. It seems as if all of us who are capable of speech, of expression, naturally expect that speech to be free. It comes out of our mouth and nobody else's, and why should anybody else have anything to say about it? I think that it feels to me obvious, and yet to so many people in so many parts of the world, it's something that needs to be constrained, narrowly defined, and repressed. And I've always thought that it's so odd, because one of the things that all human beings have in common is the ability to express themselves. And you don't have to be a writer or a journalist, just any human being has the capacity to open their mouth and say what they think. And it's always seemed to me to be weird that, given that that's the kind of species that we are, that we set up so much apparatus to prevent ourselves from doing the thing that comes naturally.
Well, does it come altogether naturally? I don't know. Freud said, for example, and I don't want to bring him into this, but he tried to work a whole practice on free expression or free associative expression, as opposed to free imaginative expression, perhaps. And his patients could be quite recalcitrant.
Yeah, I wondered when Freud was going to show up. Here he is.
Sorry, Salman. He wasn't meant to. He's not in my notes. It's just because you said this thing about everybody has the ability to speak freely, and I don't.
No, what I mean, we all have the ability to speak, and why would we not assume that that should be free? You know, why would there be an assumption of restriction? It seems like against human nature. You know, at least that's been my view. And yes, you're right, it's changed. The forces opposing free expression, you know, half a century ago when I finished my first novel, tended to be authoritarian states, authoritarian elements within any state, and tended to be politically conservative. And it tended to be if you wanted to look at it generationally, it was more likely that older people would be censorious than younger people who believed that you should, you know, let it all hang out, as we used to say. It's still true that authoritarian regimes and authoritarian voices inside other regimes are very powerfully involved in the attempt to prevent speech that they disapprove of. But now it also comes from another direction, which is very surprising, that there's a lot of young people who seem to believe that it's okay to repress speech which they don't like, and which in many ways they may be right not to like. You know, unpleasant speech. You know, but this idea that if something offends you, it should not be argued back against, it should be prevented from existing, is a thing which many young people now kind of would pay some kind of service to that idea. And so you find an attack on free expression coming from the left as well as from the right, and from the young as well as from the old, from the disenfranchised as well as from the powerful. And that's something new. And that's a thing of the last decade or so.
But this
go on.
Sorry, all I was going to say is there's this additional problem, and it's probably something to do with social media and the existence of the World Wide Web, where we all connect to other kinds of worlds, you know, within the moment. And it seems to me that that kind of nexus allows a kind of rage into the room, into the public room, which you do want to say, shut up to. Even me, I'm constantly, you know, if I do turn on Twitter or X or whatever it is, I sometimes want to say, shut up, keep that to yourself. You know, go and say it in the toilet. Don't say it to me here.
I just hardly ever go there. I mean, it just seems like a room full of people you don't want to talk to.
I think that's right. I think that's right. Maybe that's the right attitude to it. Okay, nonetheless, you carry on using words, and they are extremely important to all of us. And you've used them both to think about history in your fiction and about the present. I don't know if the two are separated in your mind when you're doing these two different things, but tell us a little bit about the process of writing historically or about history.
Well, you know, before I was a fiction writer, I was a historian. I mean, that was my subject at university. You know, I never studied literature. I studied history, and so that has been a factor in a lot of what I've written, whether it's ancient history or recent history. I mean, Midnight Children was about relatively recent history, the independence of India and Pakistan. Victory City is about as far back as I've gone. I mean, it goes back to the 14th and 15th centuries. But what I think is when we look at the past imaginatively, what we see are the things that concern us in our daily lives in the present. You know, we look at the past through the eyes of the present. And what we find there, what we notice there are things that we're concerned about anyway. You know, so it's in a way, it's just another way of writing about the present. I have to say, when I started writing Victory City, I had spent a long time, like 3 consecutive novels, trying to make sense of the United States. which is, that's hard these days. But and when I finished the last one, the last of those three books, which was Quichotte, I really thought I've kind of had enough of America for a while. And please, no more America.
And you didn't think of turning to Britain?
Well, it is true, and it's something that I think about, that I've written less about England than maybe I should have, and maybe there's something to do there that I haven't done yet. The book that I always see as my kind of London novel is the Satanic Verses, and no, because of everything that happened around that book, people don't think of it in that way. But actually, the great majority of that novel is a portrait of London in the years of Margaret Thatcher, really, and it was an attempt to write a London novel because I felt that the previous two novels, Midnight's Children and Shame, had dealt quite exhaustively with India and Pakistan, and I thought it was right to try and write about the country that I had emigrated to, to try to write a British novel, and I think of the Satanic Verses as that novel. The world formed a different opinion of it.
No, I thought of it that way too, because of course I didn't understand any of the other matter when I first read it. I thought it was a novel about migration.
Well, it is a novel about migration. And it suggests that one of the consequences of migration is that it puts into question almost everything about the self. You find yourself in a world of strangers, in a world where the language may not be your natural language, where the customs may be very different to the ones you're familiar to, where the belief systems may be different. And so everything that you bring with you, all the luggage you bring, is called into question. And I thought, if that's truly what I think, then the book that I write should be that act of questioning. And so the book tries to question all those things. And one of the things it tries to question, of course, is religious belief. And that's where the trouble arose.
Yeah. Okay, we'll stay away from that. Let's go back to the history, the history side of things, just for a minute.
The interesting thing about this book, about Victory City, is that it's been sitting in my head since before I had published a book. I made a trip in South India, in the 70s, before the publication of my first novel. And I, on that occasion, traveling very cheaply with very few resources, going on 17-hour bus journeys, I came to the ruins of the Vijayanagar Empire near the town of Hampi. And I thought two things. I thought how beautiful they were. And I thought, why don't I know anything about this? Why was I, as a child, somebody growing up in India, never told anything about this quite big force in the history of South India? So I then made it my business to try and find something out. And I remember when I wrote, 16 years ago, 17, something like that, when I wrote The Enchantress of Florence, a lot of which has to do with the Mughal Empire in North India. I remember thinking, oh, but there's that stuff in South India. That was really interesting. And maybe I should pay attention to that sometime. And so really it's taken me my whole writing life to finally find my way to this subject.
That's wonderful. The Enchantress of Florence was an extraordinary novel as well, and taught me a great deal more than I'd ever known about Indian history, and indeed about the Renaissance there, or I guess what we could call the Renaissance there.
The thing that was so interesting to me was that in these two cultures, Renaissance Italy and Mughal India, cultures which had almost no contact with each other, just about zero contact with each other, very similar developments were taking place. The idea of humanism, for example, as well as a kind of artistic explosion and philosophical explosion. So the cultures were actually rather like each other, except they were half a world apart and they didn't know anything about each other. And I thought, well, how strange that is, that these things should be happening more or less simultaneously without any connection. And so I thought, being the novelist, well, what I will do is to create the connection that historically didn't exist. And so I sent my character on a journey. She has to make the journey from one to the other, to go all the way from Mughal India to Renaissance Florence. And so in the novel, these two worlds are joined, whereas in real life they were not.
And they're partially joined by the presence of a storyteller. And story has always been extremely important to you. Tell us a little bit about story within the Indian context.
Yeah, well, something happened in Western literature about 100 years ago, around the time of the modernist movement, and Joyce and all that, where there began to be a division between the idea of serious literature and the idea of storytelling. So that pulp fiction has always remembered to tell stories. But serious literature sometimes is more interested in character and idea than in narrative. And I've always thought that that was a false separation, that there's no reason for those things to be separate. And my view is, the way I've always told myself is that if you want to build a big car, you better put a big engine in it. And narrative, story is the engine. And if you grow up in India, you are surrounded by fabulous stories. You grow up with the tales of all these different cultures and religions. And I certainly grew up with all the Hindu stories as well as stories from the Muslim. The Muslim tradition, for example, had stories of in the time of Akbar, there was this collection called the Hamza Nama, which were adventures of this quasi-historical figure called Hamza, who may or may not have been the uncle of the Prophet. But he has adventures, he kills dragons, he falls in love with fairy princesses, and he fights wars against enemies. But then there's the Hindu tradition where you have, of course, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, the animal fables of the Panchatantra. And all this stuff is given to you as your heritage. And so for me, that's where it starts. It starts with that, I mean, when people have accused me of magic realism, I think, well, okay. But actually, my source material is not South American. It's from where I came from.
Yeah, but we're here in Spain, indeed in Barcelona. And I know that you have an affinity for some writers within the Spanish, perhaps even the Catalan language. You called one of your recent non-Indian novels Quixote, which obviously has some kind of link. Tell us a little bit about your love affair or hate affair with Spain and Spanish literature.
No, it's not a hate affair. I mean, I certainly one of my novels, The Moor's Last Sigh, takes a great deal of its inspiration from the Arab period in southern Spain. And in fact, the title comes from an episode in the final defeat of the last Moorish ruler. And I was always very interested in that kind of union of cultures that took place in southern Spain. And yeah, there's lots and lots of. I mean, I feel great affection towards a lot of Spanish language literature. I just read that they have discovered an unpublished novel of Garcia Marquez.
Really?
Which is going to be published next year. It's slightly worrying because it appears to be the case that he expressed a desire that it not be published. But his sons have now okayed the publication. And I know, or it is reported, that at the time he was writing this book, he was struggling against dementia. So I really worried that something has been authorized which should not have been authorized. which everybody will read because of the name of the author.
Yeah.
But it may not do him justice, you know. I remember this happened somewhat to Hemingway after he died, that various manuscripts were pulled out of cardboard boxes and edited by other people and published, and they didn't really do his reputation that much good.
Have you got a stashed novel of yours that you're worried about?
I have some, actually, if you wanted to ever dive into my archives, which are stored at the University of Emory in Austin, in Atlanta, Georgia, there are some early, never published, deeply unpublishable manuscripts.
Oh, I can see the boys are waiting. Salman,
which I absolutely refuse to allow to be published.
I know you're going to read to us from the beginning of Victory City, but just a word first about that. I mean, your lead character, Baba Kambana, is an extraordinary woman, a feminist, dare I say, avant le jour. Where has she come from? Where did she take wing?
You know, really, she came from nowhere. I wasn't expecting her. I was thinking about a couple of technical problems. One was, how do you write a book that lasts for 250 years without the book being 2,000 pages long, which I didn't want. And the other question, if you look at the history of the period, this empire seems to come from nowhere. You know, if you look at even like a decade before, it's not there. There are other kingdoms going along perfectly nicely. And then suddenly, out of the blue, this thing emerges and takes over everything. And I thought, how does that happen? How does an empire arise kind of almost out of thin air? And this 9-year-old girl showed up and she said, I have the answer to your question.
Would you like to read her to us?
The way you tell a story that's 250 years long is you find a character, which happens to be me, who's going to live for 250 years.
Great.
And the way you created an imperial city out of nowhere is with this bag of magic seeds, which I have here. Just sprinkle the magic seeds on the ground and the empire will rise.
Oh, we need one, we need one.
Yeah. So literally she came. I guess the way it really began was that there is a historical origin to the episode that I'm going to read a bit of, with which the book begins, which is this mass suicide of women. And I read about that, and I just imagined a young girl watching this happen, which were all the women in her life, up to and including her mother, walk into the fire. And what would that do to her, and where would she go from there? And that's really where the book began.
So read it to us, Salman, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. It's been really just say how I'm so pleased to be back in Barcelona, even in this way. And I hope next time it'll be in the real way.
Please.
Okay, so this is from the early part of Victory City. The story of Bisnaga began in the 14th century of the Common Era, in the south of what we now call India, Bharat, Hindustan. The old king, whose rolling head got everything going, wasn't much of a monarch, just the type of ersatz ruler who crops up between the decline of one great kingdom and the rise of another. His name was Kampila, of the tiny principality of Kampili, Kampila Raya, Raya being the regional version of Raja, king. This second-rate Raya had just about enough time on his third-rate throne to build a fourth-rate fortress on the banks of the Pampa River, to put a fifth-rate temple inside it, and to carve a few grandiose inscriptions into the side of a rocky hill. But then the army of the north came south to deal with him. The battle that followed was a one-sided affair, and so unimportant that nobody bothered to give it a name. After the people from the north had routed Kampilaraya's forces and killed most of his army, they grabbed hold of the phony king and chopped off his crownless head. Then they filled it with straw and sent it north for the pleasure of the Delhi Sultan. There's nothing particularly special about the battle without a name or about the head. In those days, battles were commonplace affairs, and naming them was a thing a lot of people didn't bother with. And severed heads were traveling across our great land all the time for the pleasure of this prince or that one. The Sultan in his northern capital city had built up quite a collection. After the insignificant battle, surprisingly, there was an event of the kind that changes history. The story goes that the women of the tiny defeated kingdom, most of them recently widowed as a result of the no-name battle, left the fourth-rate fortress after making final offerings at the fifth-rate temple, crossed the river in small boats, improbably defying the turbulence of the water, walked some distance to the west along the southern bank, and then lit a great bonfire and committed mass suicide in the flames. Gravely, without making any complaint, they said farewell to one another and walked forward without flinching. Nor were there any screams when their flesh caught fire and the stink of death filled the air. They burned in silence. Only the crackling of the fire itself could be heard. Pampa Kampana saw it all happen. It was as if the universe itself was sending her a message saying, "Open your ears, breathe in, and learn." She was 9 years old and stood watching with tears in her eyes, holding her dry-eyed mother's hand as tightly as she could, while all the women she knew entered the fire and sat or stood or lay in the heart of the furnace, spouting flames from their ears and mouths. The old woman who had seen everything, and the young woman just starting out in life, and the girl who hated her father, the dead soldier, and the wife who was ashamed of her husband because he hadn't given up his life on the battlefield, and the woman with the beautiful singing voice, and the woman with the frightening laugh, and the woman as skinny as a stick, and the woman as fat as a melon. Into the fire they marched, and the stench of their death made Pampa feel like retching. And then, to her horror, her own mother, Radha Kampana, gently detached her hand, and very slowly, but with absolute conviction, walked forward to join the bonfire of the dead, without even saying goodbye.
Thank you so much, Salman. Sorry, that was a double one because I didn't have my mic. Wonderful. We're all going to go off and read it now. And we're going to read, first of all, from the rest of your wonderful books. Come back to Barcelona soon. I'll come back too, if I can.
That would be very nice. That would be very nice. And thank you all for having me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Salman Rushdie acaba de llegir les primeres línies del seu darrer llibre, Ciudad Victoria, publicat a Random House amb traducció de Luis Murillo Fort. Un altre llibre de Rushdie en què la figura d'una gran dona vertebra la narració és L'encantadora de Florència. El fragment que escoltarem relata l'empresonament d'un foraster a la cort de l'emperador renaixentista Gran Mogol Akbar, portador de la història d'aquesta dona enigmàtica. Llegeix el fragment Marta Marco, amb traducció de Marta Pera Cucurell i publicat a Bromera.
En la foscor del calabós, les cadenes l'aclaparaven tant com la seva història inacabada. Hi havia tantes cadenes donant voltes al seu cos que li semblava, a les fosques, que l'havien encastat en un cos més gran, el cos d'un home de ferro. Moure's era impossible. La llum era una fantasia. El calabós estava excavat a la roca viva del turó que hi havia sota els palaus imperials i l'aire de la cel·la tenia 1000 anys i segurament també els tenien les bestioles que se li arrossegaven sobre els peus i entre els cabells i que li entraven a l'engonal, els escarbats albins, les serps cegues, les rates transparents, els escorpins espectrals, els polls. Moriria sense explicar la història. Aquest pensament era intolerable, però es negava a abandonar-lo. Li entrava i li sortia de les orelles amb una munió de potetes. Se li esmunyia dintre de les comissures dels ulls. Se li enganxava al paladar i a la carn tova de sota la llengua. Tots els homes necessitaven sentir les seves històries explicades. Ell era un home, però si moria sense explicar la història seria menys que un home. Seria un escarbat al vi, un poll. El calabós no entenia el concepte d'història. El calabós era estàtic, etern, negre. I una història necessitava moviment, temps i llum. Notava que la història se li escapava. Esdevenia intranscendent, deixava de ser. No tenia història, no hi havia història. Ell no era un home. Allà no hi havia cap home. Només hi havia el calabós i la foscor lliscosa. Quan el van anar a buscar no sabia si havia passat un dia o un segle. No podia veure les mans aspres que li deslligaven les cadenes. Durant una estona també va tenir l'oïda afectada i la capacitat de parlar. Li van tapar els ulls i se'l van emportar, despullat, a un altre lloc on el van posar sota un raig d'aigua i el van fregar. Com si fos un cadàver que preparaven per a l'enterrament, va pensar. Un cadàver mut que no podia contar la seva narració. No hi havia taüts en aquesta terra no cristiana. El cosirien a l'interior d'una mortalla i el llançarien sense nom en un forat, a terra. O això, o el cremarien. No descansaria en pau. Un cop mort, de la mateixa manera que en vida, estaria ple de paraules no pronunciades que serien el seu infern i el tormentarien durant tota l'eternitat. Va sentir un so. Una vegada hi havia... Era la seva pròpia veu. Una vegada hi havia un príncep. Va notar que el cor li tornava a bategar i que la sang corria. Tenia la llengua inflada, però la podia moure. Dintre del pit el cor retrunyia com un canó, que posseïa armes màgiques. Tornava a tenir cos i paraules. Li van destapar els ulls. 4 gegants terribles i una dona. Es trobava en una altra cel·la, però en aquesta hi cremava una espelma. Hi havia un guàrdia en un racó. La dona més vella. La història li salvava la vida. Guarda't les forces, li va dir el guàrdia. Demà et sotmeten a judici per assassinat.
Les històries són perilloses en l'obra de Salman Rushdie, però la seva defensa de la ficció és aferrissada. L'any 1990, un any després de la fàtua, va escriure un assaig que advocava en favor de la ficció. Nada es sagrado. L'escriptor Rodrigo Fresán llegeix un fragment d'aquest assaig amb traductor de Ramon d'Espanya i publicat a la revista Gran en espanyol l'any 2015.
Crecí besando los libros y el pan. En casa, cada vez que a alguien se le caía un libro o dejaba caer un chapati o una rebanada, que era la palabra que utilizábamos para describir un triángulo de pan tostado con mantequilla, el objeto no solo debía ser recogido, sino también besado, a guisa de disculpa ante un acto de irrespetuosa torpeza. Yo era tan descuidado y manazas como cualquier crío. Así pues, durante mis años infantiles, tuve que besar un gran número de rebanadas, así como una notable cantidad de libros. Los hogares indios devotos contaban y siguen contando con personas acostumbradas a besar libros sagrados, pero nosotros lo besábamos todo. Besábamos diccionarios y atlas, besábamos las novelas de Enid Blyton y los tebeos de Superman. Si alguna vez se me hubiese caído el listín telefónico, lo más probable es que también me hubiera tocado besarlo. Todo esto sucedía antes de haber podido besar a una chica. De hecho, casi podría afirmarse, pues resultaría asaz creíble en un autor de ficción, que en cuanto me lancé a besar chicas, mis actividades con respecto al pan y a los libros perdieron gran parte de su capacidad estimulante. Pero nunca te olvidas de tus primeros amores. pan y libros, comida para el cuerpo y comida para el alma. ¿Qué podía resultar más merecedor de respeto e incluso de amor? La literatura es un informe interno desde la conciencia del artista, por lo que nunca nada puede considerarse terminado o perfecto. La literatura se elabora en la frontera entre uno mismo y el mundo, y en el acto de la creación esa frontera se ablanda y deviene permeable, permitiendo que el mundo se cuele en el artista y el artista en el mundo. Nada tan inexacto, tan fácil y frecuentemente equivocado merece la protección de ser declarado sacrosanto. Nos conformaremos con seguir adelante sin el escudo de la sacralización, y más nos vale así. No debemos convertirnos en aquello a lo que nos oponemos. La literatura es el único lugar de toda sociedad en el que, dentro del secretismo de nuestra propia cabeza, podemos oír voces que hablan de todo y de todas las maneras posibles. El motivo para asegurarse de que esa arena privilegiada se mantenga no es que los escritores deseen una libertad absoluta para decir y hacer lo que les plazca. El motivo es que nosotros, todos nosotros, lectores y escritores y ciudadanos y generales y hombres de Dios, necesitamos esa pequeña habitación de aspecto banal. No necesitamos considerarla sagrada, pero sí recordar que es necesaria. Sabido es, escribió Saul Bellow en Las aventuras de Oggy March, que toda supresión es burda. Suprimes una cosa y en el acto estás suprimiendo la de al lado. Siempre que en algún rincón del mundo se ha cerrado el cuartito de la literatura, las paredes, tarde o temprano, se han venido abajo.
El seu llibre més polèmic, Els versos satànics, és de fet una de les grans novel·les sobre la migració i sobre la Gran Bretanya de l'època de Thatcher, com ens acaba de confirmar. Tot seguit n'escoltem l'inici, on se'ns presenten els seus dos protagonistes a punt de patir una transformació. Llegeix la Lisa Appignanesi amb una traducció al català de Màxim Rovira, publicat a Columna l'any 1989.
To be born again, sang Jibril Farishta, tumbling from the heavens. First you have to die. Hoji, hoji, to land upon the bosomy earth. First one needs to fly. The aircraft cracked in half, a seed pod giving up its spores, an egg yielding its mystery. Two actors, prancing Jibril and botany-pursed Mr. Saladin Shamsa, fell like titbits of tobacco from a broken old cigar. Above, behind, below them in the void, there hung reclining seats, stereophonic headsets, drinks trolleys, motion discomfort receptacles, disembarkation cards, duty-free video games, braided caps, paper cups, blankets, oxygen masks. Also, but there had been more than a few migrants aboard. Yes, quite a quantity of wives who had been grilled by reasonable doing-their-job officials about the length of and distinguishing moles upon their husbands' genitalia, a sufficiency of children upon whose legitimacy the British government had cast its ever-reasonable doubts. Mingling with the remnants of the plane, equally fragmented, equally absurd, there floated the debris of the soul, broken memories, sloughed-off selves, severed mother tongues, violated privacies, untranslatable jokes, extinguished futures, lost loves, the forgotten meaning of hollow, booming words. Land, belonging, home. Knocked a little silly by the blast, Jibril and Saladin plummeted like bundles dropped by some carelessly open-beaked stork. And because Shamsa was going down head first in the recommended position for babies entering the birth canal, he commenced to feel a low irritation at the other's refusal to fall in plain fashion. Saladin nosedived, while Farishta embraced air, hugging it with his arms and legs, the flailing, overwrought actor without techniques of restraint. Below, cloud-covered, awaiting their entrance, the slow, congealed currents of the English sleeve, the appointed zone of their watery reincarnation. Oh, my shoes are Japanese, Jibrail sang, translating the old song into English in semi-conscious deference to the uprushing host nation. These trousers English, if you please. On my head, red Russian hat. My heart's Indian for all that. The clouds were bubbling up towards him. And perhaps it was on account of that great mystification of cumulus and cumulonimbus, the mighty rolling thunderheads standing like hammers in the dawn. Or perhaps it was the singing, the one busy performing, the other booing the performance, or their blast, delirium that spared them full foreknowledge of the imminent. But for whatever reason, the two men, Jibril Saladin, Farishta Shamsha, condemned to this endless but also ending angelic devilish fall, did not become aware of the moment at which the processes of their transmutation began.
Els fills de la mitjanit, la segona novel·la de Rushdie, va guanyar el Booker of Bookers i va ser traduïda a més de 25 idiomes. El seu protagonista té estranys poders que el vinculen màgicament a totes les criatures nascudes al moment exacte de la partició de l'Índia per part dels britànics. Com en altres narracions de Rushdie, la història en majúscula i les històries personals s'entrelliguen a l'estil d'una comèdia de Rabelais. L'escriptora Gemma Ruiz llegeix un fragment de la novel·la amb traducció de Joan Sallent Arús.
Vaig néixer a la ciutat de Bombai fa molt de temps. No, això no val. La data no es pot esquivar. Vaig néixer a la clínica particular del doctor Narlikar el 15 d'agost de 1947. I l'hora també compta. Doncs bé, a la nit. No, convé ser més al punt de la mitjanit, de fet. Les manetes dels rellotges sonien en respectuosa benvinguda quan jo vaig arribar. Va, deixeu anar. A l'instant precís en què l'Índia assolia la independència, jo arribava de tomballons en aquest món. Va haver-hi sobresalts i a l'altra banda de la finestra, castell de focs i multituds. Pocs segons després, el meu pare es va trencar el dit gros del peu. Però aquest incident va ser una mera insignificança si el comparem amb el que em va passar a mi en aquell tenebrós moment, perquè gràcies a les ocultes tiranies d'aquells rellotges que em saludaven amb placidesa, vaig ser misteriosament emmanillat a la història i els meus destins indissolublement encadenats als del meu país. Durant les 3 dècades següents no hi hauria escapatòria. Els endevins m'havien profetitzat, els diaris van celebrar la meva arribada, els politicastres van ratificar la meva autenticitat. A mi em van deixar sense veu ni vot en la qüestió. Jo, Salim Sinai, després diversament anomenat nas de mocs, carabrut, calvet, muntalla amunt, Buda i fins i tot bocí de lluna, m'havia embrancat profundament amb el destí. En el millor dels casos, una implicació perillosa. I aleshores no sabia ni eixugar-me el nas. Ara, però, el temps, que ja ha deixat de fer-me cap servei, es va escolant. Aviat faré 31 anys, potser, si ho permet aquest meu cos desgastat que s'esmicola, però no tinc cap esperança de salvar la vida, ni puc tan sols refiar-me de tenir 1001 nits. Haig de treballar de pressa, més de pressa que Xerazada, si al capdavall vull donar a entendre, alguna cosa. Ho reconec, per damunt de tot em fa por l'absurditat. Hi ha tantes històries per explicar, massa, un excés tal de vides, esdeveniments, miracles, llocs, rumors entreteixits, una barreja tan densa de l'improbable i el mundà. He estat un engolidor de vides i per poder-me conèixer, només per poder conèixer la meva, haureu d'engolir-ho tot plegat. Multituds consumides empenyen i es pataneguen a dintre meu i guiat només pel record d'un gran llençol blanc amb un forat al mig, més o menys circular, i d'unes 7 polzades de diàmetre, aferrat al somni d'aquell tros de roba quadrat, mutilat i foradat, que és el meu talismà, el meu obre sèsam, haig d'iniciar l'operació de reconstruir la meva vida des del moment en què va començar, en realitat, uns 32 anys abans d'una cosa tan òbvia, tan present, com el meu naixement dominat pel rellotge i tacat pel delicte. El llençol, per cert, també estacat, amb 3 gotes de vella i descolorida vermelló. Tal com ens diu l'Alcorà, reciteu en nom del Senyor creador vostre, que creà l'home de grumolls de sang.
L'obra de Rushdie abasta des de l'Índia a la Gran Bretanya fins als Estats Units per retornar a l'Índia i així mateix la història s'entreteixeix amb el present i el futur. Acabem aquesta lectura amb un passatge de La decadència del Nero Golden, la novel·la sobre la riquesa, la corrupció a Orient i a Occident i l'arribada dels Estats Units de Trump. Llegeix el fragment l'actriu Tamara Ngdong amb traducció de Marc Rubió.
Un home savi va suggerir una vegada que Manhattan per sota del carrer 14 a les 3 de la matinada del 28 de novembre era la ciutat de Gotham, de Batman. Manhattan, entre els carrers 14 i 110, el dia més serè i assolellat de juliol, era la metròpolis de Superman. I Spider-Man, aquell nouvingut penjat de cap per avall a Queens, pensant en el poder i la responsabilitat. Totes aquestes ciutats, les ciutats imaginàries, invisibles, que hi ha per sobre, al voltant i entreteixides amb la de veritat. Totes continuaven intactes, malgrat que després de les eleccions, el Joker, els cabells verds i lluminosos del triomf, la pell blanca com una caputxa del Ku Klux Klan, els llavis vermells regalimant-li de sang anònima, les governava totes. Efectivament, el Joker s'havia convertit en rei i vivia al cel en una casa daurada. Els ciutadans van recórrer el tòpic i es van recordar ells mateixos que encara hi havia ocells als arbres i que el cel no havia caigut i que sovint encara era blau. Les ciutats es mantenien dempeus i a la ràdio i a les aplicacions de música dels auriculars Bluetooth dels joves despreocupats, el ritme continuava. Els Yankees continuaven capficats per la rotació dels llançadors. Els Mets continuaven rendint per sota de les seves possibilitats i els Nikes continuaven condemnats per la maledicció de ser els Nikes. Internet continuava ple de mentides i el negoci de la veritat se n'havia anat en orris. Els millors havien perdut tota convicció i els pitjors estaven plens d'una intensitat apassionada i la ira dels injustos deixava al descobert la debilitat dels justos. Però la república es mantenia més o menys intacta. Deixeu-me apuntar això, perquè era una afirmació que es feia sovint per consolar els que no ens deixàvem consolar fàcilment. En certa manera, és una ficció, però jo la repeteixo. Sé que després de la tempesta ve una altra tempesta i després una altra. Sé que el temps tempestuós serà la previsió meteorològica de manera permanent i que els dies feliços no tornaran i que la intolerància és la nova negror i que el sistema està realment falsejat, només que no pas de la manera que el pallasso malvat ens ha intentat fer creure. A vegades els dolents guanyen. I què pots fer quan el món en què creus resulta que és una lluna de paper i apareix un planeta fosc que et diu «No, el món sóc jo». Com pots viure entre els teus conciutadans quan no saps quins d'ells formen part dels més de 60 milions que han portat l'horror al poder? Quan no saps quins formen part dels més de 90 milions que van arronsar les espatlles i es van quedar a casa? O quan els teus paisans et diuen que saber coses és elitista i que odien les èlits i l'única cosa que has tingut en la vida és la ment i et van educar per creure en l'encant del coneixement, no pas en aquesta bestiesa segons la qual la informació o el coneixement és poder, sinó que el coneixement és bellesa. I després tot això, l'educació, l'art, la música, el cine, es converteixen en una raó perquè et menyspreïn. I la criatura sortida de l'Spiritus Mundi s'alça i s'encamina encorbada cap a Washington DC per néixer.
Moltíssimes gràcies a aquests fantàstics lectors i lectores. Posem punt i final a aquesta inauguració del Festival Kosmopolis, que durant els propers 5 dies omplirà el CCCB de paraula i d'imaginació. Acabo només amb 2 apunts. Primer, agraint una altra vegada a la Lisa Appignanesi que ens hagi volgut acompanyar aquest vespre i recordar-vos a tots que el divendres estarà en una conversa amb l'escriptora també britànica Deborah Levy aquí mateix, en aquest mateix escenari. I després dir-vos que per celebrar aquest inici de festival us convidem a tots a una copa al pati de les dones quan acabem. Moltíssimes gràcies.